very, very warm welcome here to this Transformations event at our Field Research Church Methodologies. My name is Jackie Butchson. I'm a professor in the law school at the University of Warwick. Until recently, I was a Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and City of Culture, and as you'll know, Coventry was UK City of Culture a few years ago, was a really key part of my portfolio. So I was very lucky to be able to work with lots of fantastic colleagues, including Helen and many of the researchers here today and others at Warwick. And we funded over 120 projects and worked with over 60 local artists. And working with the Coventry Biennial was a really important part of that. And we didn't want that to stop with Coventry City of Culture. It really had changed our research practice, and we really saw the benefits around impact and engagement of not just collaborating with artists, but really moving to co-creating with artists, so that artists and the university would work together increasingly closely. So we managed to get some funding together, spoke to Ryan and colleagues, and talked about whether or not we might actually fund an artist to work with a researcher over a more lengthy period of time to produce something which hopefully you've all seen that Graeme and Paul produced as part of the Coventry Biennial. And then really we wanted to go beyond that again and to really celebrate this work and to really demonstrate to people the nature of it, its value, and for you to get excited and to get inspired by it. So we obviously wanted to go beyond Warwick and show that this is a kind of turn in the way that we're thinking about arts, creative practice and academic research on a national scale. It's not just something that's happening at Warwick. So we've pulled together this day. We think it's a really exciting programme. And that's it really. I'm no longer a deputy PVC. I'm stepping down. My colleague John Kofi is here. So this event is almost quite a nice way of handing on, I think, some of that work to him. But thanks so much for coming, and I've really enjoyed working with lots of you who I can see very familiar faces in the audience today. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague Helen Wheatley, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the day and the Warwick Institute of Engagement role.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Professor Helen Wheatley. I'm academic director of Warwick Institute of Engagement. And as well as bringing artists and researchers together, the Coventry Biennial project has brought colleagues in the research executive and colleagues in the Institute of Engagement together, as well as with our colleagues at the Biennial and with Graeme and Paul, who we worked with. So Institute of Engagement does what it says on the tin. It's all about engaging people with research, the widest possible audience with research. And one of the ways that we might do that is through meetings, collaborations, co-productions between artists and researchers, as Jackie just mentioned. So today is not planned as a series of dry academic papers, but rather a set of conversations between people who've worked together and created new work together, created new research, changed artistic practice, done something cool through those collaborations. So you'll hear a series of conversations. There'll be people around filming, as you can see, taking pictures. Please give one of us a shout if you don't wish to appear on any pictures or in any of the films that are produced out of today. We hope you enjoy the day. We hope you take some time to have a look around the Biennial exhibition, which is in its closing weekend this weekend, certainly here at the Herbert Art Gallery and Museum. So do make sure that you see the fantastic work that Ryan and his team have brought together. I'm going to hand over to Ryan now, talk a little bit about why the Biennial wanted to work with us at the university, I guess, and to introduce Graeme and Paul as well.
Sure, thank you very much. And I'm going to stay seated. It feels you've described today as slightly relaxed, so I'm going to be slightly relaxed.
You're absolutely
So my name's Ryan Hughes. I'm the Artistic Director and CEO of Coventry Biennial. We're a social, political, critical platform for contemporary art that predominantly delivers programmes here in Coventry, but also across nearby Warwickshire. And of course, working with the University of Warwick, certainly since 2019, we had saw that we had these really great opportunities to be bringing innovative, creative, experimental artistic practices into really direct dialogue with the equivalent bodies of research that were were really pushing ideas in different areas of work. And so it became increasingly exciting to be putting these different experts together. And really for 2023, it felt like actually coming out of UK City of Culture, this was a moment that we could work together to really, as you've both said, sort of embed that way of working, expand that way of working. And I think the project that I hope you have seen just out of this door to the left, on the right, that Paul Lemon and Graeme MacDonald have made together, I think really evidences some of the creative impact that this way of working can have. And I won't say too much more about the biennial. Again, as Jackie and Helen have said, I hope you'll all see the show. For those of you that might be in town for a little bit longer, on Sunday I will just plug that we have a Coventry Biennial bike ride inspired by the work that Paul and Graeme have done together. So we'll be taking in some of the sites that are referred to in their artwork. But beyond that, I will just, I guess, invite Paul and Graeme to join us on stage. Thank you both.
Thank you. Is this? Yeah, it's working.
You've got a funky looking one.
I've got a special one. Yeah. Is this working? Yeah, it is. Yes.
It's a 1970s one, it's good.
So, I mean, the first thing I should ask you both to do is really to introduce yourselves, of course. And perhaps, Graeme, if you could tell us a little bit about your research. Paul, if you could tell us a little bit about your practice. And I'm going to just give you just a couple of minutes each, so I'm afraid just the headlines. And then we can, once the audience here know who you both are, of course, we can get into the conversation about the work that you've done together.
Sure. It's great to be here. Hi. I'm Professor in the English and Comparative Literary Studies Department at Warwick, and I'm also the convener of the new Environmental Humanities MA there, which is in its first year. So that's a shameless plug. And I guess my work is engaged with a research project which is about maybe a decade old now, so it's relatively young in academic terms, called Petrocultures, which is really an interest in the artistic and cultural literary registrations of oil and fossil fuel cultures in the large. And obviously with an eye on the climate crisis in relation to how we figure out what oil means to us and what an after-oil world might mean. And I've worked with an international research cluster called, funnily enough, Petrocultures, on that for the last 10 years, and a splinter group of that called After Oil, which has produced collective works of writing and other forms of research, policy, and so on, and engagement, and is in its third iteration right now on renewable cultures. We've published on oil generally and how you get after it, and then through solar power, and the third one is on the problems actually of renewable energy coming up. And the last thing I'll say is I also teach a course on science fiction, so the interest in futures, which will probably come out later in the conversation, comes from that and work I did as part of a larger international research grant through the Swedish research foundation called Formas with the University of Lund in Sweden and the Urban Future Studio in Utrecht in the Netherlands called Climaginaries, which is basically just climate imaginaries put together. And that was with a bunch of different people from different disciplines, from political scientists to climate modelers, artists, writers, and literary scholars like me, who worked on basically how you narrate a post-fossil future and how you kind of come up with futures ideas that can be put into practice. And we did a number of those, and I guess they'll come out in the wash.
Perfect, thank you. And Paul, can you tell us a bit about your practice?
Yeah, well, I'm first and foremost a painter, I would say, although I did actually also train as a graphic designer, so that feeds into my work and my practice. Originally from Birmingham and trained in London, lived there for many years, and I came back to Coventry about 2 years ago. So I was very pleased to have come back at the right time. My paintings are basically oil paintings, but what I utilise is cyberspace, if you like. So I collect digital video, I play around with it, and from that create compositions that I then translate into what you would say, I guess, are analog objects, which are the paintings. So I'm fundamentally interested in the way that screens work, the way that we interact with screens, the way that we absorb information, see the outside world, if you like, through the medium of screens, which are almost a kind of, if you like, an invisible veil between us and the world. And I guess the kind of style of imagery that I use is what you would normally kind of associate with the word glitch. But, you know, it's the kind of thing we've all seen where the video goes wrong, the signal doesn't work. And it's a kind of visual clue as to the thing that I'm dealing with, which is the digital world and the way that, you know, so much of life has been digitized and we are forced to interact with that. So that's something I'm very, very interested in. And also as cyberspace, as a kind of, almost a kind of geology, if you like, a thing that we can mine, a thing that we can extract, but also a kind of terrain that we all sort of are forced to exist in. And so I'm interested in kind of reversing the analog to digital and take it in a reverse direction and take the digital and make it into real objects, which seems to me to be something that has become much more kind of relevant now. You know, interaction with the real world and with material things seems to have become a much more fundamental, you know, kind of desire for people. So I'm interested in kind of creating objects that people can become immersed in the same way that they might become immersed in the digital world, but in a kind of more fundamentally sort of healthy way, I guess.
Perfect, thank you. So, as I'm sure you will all agree, when we were developing this project, we could immediately see the possibility that these guys working together presented. There's this sort of shared interest that you both have in futures, in ideas of the future and in the materiality of the future. Could you perhaps both share a little bit about how about your collaboration? We understand now where you've both come from separately. How has that materialized over the past almost year of you guys working together?
Well, I mean, a number of artists, including myself, were invited to submit in response to Graeme's submission to you, I think. So it was an invitation, really. I mean, Graeme and I didn't know each other beforehand. I didn't know anyone at Warwick University, but it was an invitation, wasn't it? So we came together as a result of your organisational project, really.
And has that invitation been fruitful?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I would say Graeme sort of became like a muse to me as an artist.
That's good, I'll take that. That's good.
In an enlarged, broad sense.
That's fine.
Because we weren't meeting every week and we weren't sort of sitting down talking all of the time. But the effect that your research and the reading that you gave me to do and a sort of induction into the academic world at Warwick University and being introduced to things that I wouldn't have necessarily even had access to, let alone have encountered, was a real kind of galvanization. And it's something that I, as an artist, carried with me, because obviously I'm painting a lot of time painting over the past year, which you have to do in solitude. You know, Graeme's not looking over my shoulder saying, "Oh, make that bit blue, make that bit red." You know, it requires solitude. So we weren't working together in that sense. And when you were doing your writing, you know, you were out there in solitude doing the same thing. So I sort of carried, I don't know, your kind of image with me, which kind of spurred me on and kind of inspired me to think about how we were going to create this artwork and what it would be like.
What he's not saying is we geeked out on on science
Yeah, we
fiction,
did.
actually, and the question and the power of science fiction and what future imaginaries might quite hold. So we actually did bond over different old and new novels that we'd thought about together. And he also had a very deep, I mean, just beyond the form of the work itself, had a passion for what that might mean for environmental transitions and changes and so on. I mean, I will also say that I applied to a call from the co-creation transformations project from the university, which I thought was really alluring. I had worked with, on part of the After Oil project, quite a few artists beforehand, but not person to person, as it were. They were always kind of part of a group. So I'd never really kind of like actually thought, okay, I want to try and bring the processes and methods that we've learned from the different research projects around the world, from Canada to Sweden and so on, to Coventry, which was into my own university, and maybe to kind of like apply it locally. So the project really did give me the opportunity to at least state that. And actually, I also will say that the facilitation process that the biennial created subsequently for the partnering of the artists, which is a really difficult thing. I never really actually figured out what that might be before it was consummately handled. I mean, it was really, really fascinating the way that they curated different artists and got us together. And I could sense right away from Paul's enthusiasm for various different things that it was going to work. So actually, weirdly, I mean, the formal thing was the exciting thing that came a wee bit later in terms of the actual work that he produced. So the kind of, if you like, the environmental politics of it were important to me, and the commitment to that was significant, and that's been terrific ever since, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had quite a lot of conversations, enthusiastic kind of debates about all of the issues before, you know, I even put brush to not canvas panel, or we even started, you know, working with any text, didn't we? We were just kind of ranging around the subject, and it opened my eyes as well to all of the climate issues, which obviously all of us as human beings, you know, are affected by, and maybe sometimes try not to think about because it can be overwhelming. And I certainly felt the sense of being overwhelmed once I started to kind of engage with the subject, which is kind of slightly terrifying. As well as terrifying that you're doing a public commission, if I may say so. But the effect of talking about those things was really transformative to me. And also the idea of collaborating in itself. I mean, I think as a painter, the word collaboration can be a kind of tricky concept because, you know, you're on your own in the studio making work and you don't want people interfering in that. And I'd never thought I would collaborate with anyone until I found myself in this position where it seemed like the best thing to do.
That's an interesting one. I think I will. I mean, we're riffing, so is that okay? But the big thing that we could have had an issue with was actually the narrative direction of the timeline and the feel of the timeline, because...
But before we get into the feel of the timeline, could I ask you perhaps both to describe what you've made together?
Yeah, he's good at that.
I'm aware that not everybody perhaps has seen the work, so before we describe what's in the timeline, can we describe what the timeline is?
Well, if you haven't seen the work, it is literally just down in that room there. So the big, long 6 metre panel. There it is. But that's not the work. That's a representation of the work, right? But it consists of a painting made of 4 panels, which is essentially abstract. But you can see that it's engaging with the screenic environment that we have, and certainly how we absorb information about climate, you know, from the TV, from computers, from your phone. And underneath, in concert with the imagery, there is a text, or several text panels, which form what we're calling a timeline, which stretches from 1850 to 2123. And it looks at generally positive developments towards transition, with the end date being the end of the climate crisis. So it's fundamentally a kind of utopian, positive kind of angle, but not as a prediction, but positioning the viewer as if they are in the future, looking back at what has already happened. So that's one of the things that I kind of absorbed from Graeme's research, was that the idea of creating a different psychological effect in the minds of people in terms of climate. a kind of, I hesitate to use the word positive because it sounds naive, but grasping the possibility that we might actually be able to do this. How does that affect the way I see it and my life? How does that affect the way I see the world? And it's easier to be dystopian, and we wanted to be kind of utopian and say, hey, you know, how would life be better if we do actually make transition? Not what we have to give up, but what might we gain? So we certainly put that into the timeline. And the painting really is a kind of chronological but also geological survey or panorama of transition. So broadly speaking, at one end you have a kind of representation of extractive petroculture, dirty coal, oil, all the way through various elements, right to a kind of hallucinogenic right-hand side, which is a kind of the future, if you like. So broadly speaking, it takes that, it follows that kind of movement, but you can read into it kind of whatever comes to mind and whatever resonates with you as you're looking at the imagery. It's purposely ambiguous.
And sorry, if you can remember where you were before I interrupted.
That's totally fine. I mean, I forgot to say that. So part of the work that I've been done with a group on a different project was about a kind of. Well, a couple of things. One was a future museum. It was called the Museum of Carbon Ruins, which was both an actual physical installation that was movable, and it appeared around various different places in Sweden and Norway, and then I did what you could adapt it to different places. What it was effectively was a kind of timeline from now until 2051 or 2052, with the idea and the timeline being that we'd actually managed, or at least Sweden had actually managed to make net zero. So there was an immediate provocation right there, that we were kind of hopeful enough that it would get it with lots of bumps in the road. And you just made up stuff after 2018, credibly based on some models, and then also with some kind of speculation about politics and so on and so forth, and inventions that might happen along the way. But it was a method as much as a kind of narrative pitch, by which I mean that you could actually move it to something with a slightly darker hue or a more utopian hue. You can change the narrative, as it were, and it was designed to provoke the audience that would engage with it to say, well, it might not work like that, or it might not work like that. So, for example, you know, one of the objects in the museum was the last jar of North Sea oil, which ends, by the way, I don't know if you know this, in 2026, right? Complete, and you know, so 3 or 4 years down the line from that, that's just obviously not going to happen. But the provocation was enough for that to work through. So they had physical objects in the museum, and you could move it around. And I did one for Glasgow and Scotland and the UK in COP